Milton's not very happy about that. Not that he doesn't think pastors need to be educated, but he thinks everyone needs to be educated and deserves an education, not just those who are going to go into the clergy or just going to be teachers. He thinks that people who are going to be active in the world and useful in their society need to be equally educated. So it's not going to be, the purpose of education isn't to create more academics and scholastics. That's what he's pushing back against, actually. So as astonishing as it might seem, Milton is writing an anti-academic treatise of education. Because up to this point, the schoolmen, the scholastics, have education in their grip. He wants it to be practical, to be useful. Remember, the second purpose is to fit a man to perform justly, skillfully, and magnanimously, with great spirit. All the offices, both private and public, of peace and of war, of all things. We need not just our clerics to understand things and live that way. We want our whole republic to live a life pleasing to God. And so he has a means of doing this. And he proposes it. And this is not a new agenda, but it is new in the sense that it was there in the ancient world, but it's been lost by Christians. Christians made it into a sterile academic exercise. Education is to become people like me. I'm not so vain. I hope that you don't all become academics. Some of you are of better use than that in other areas and should go into those things. By the way, when I said this to a first-year student many years ago, he dropped out after first year. I've never told the administration this. And he now serves as a prison guard. And he's thrilled with it. He wrote me about 5-10 years after and thanked me because he didn't want to be here and he wasn't cut out for it. And he is serving God in that sort of work. Just suited him, and I think it's great. Not that I thought he was great he dropped out, but that was great that he didn't waste his time doing something that he knew he wasn't fit to do or wasn't gifted in or desiring to do. I don't think everyone should get a university education. But that's also said to be elitist. I don't think it's elitist, because I don't think university education is the most important education. I think it's vital, but all education is important. What the community colleges do is important. Very. How did he come to this? So let me give you a little background. How did he come to this conclusion? It was partly from his own experience. Let me talk about a little bit Milton's education here. When he went to St. Paul's School, a very famous little school in London, he had been taught good literature in Latin and Greek. But he'd been taught, it was formed by and endowed, or at least refounded, it's older than this, but in 1512, so more than 100 years before Milton's time, by John Colet, C-O-L-E-T, and he declared that students were to be taught good literature, both Latin and Greek, but, and I quote, specifically Christian authors that wrote their wisdom with clean and chaste Latin, either in verse or prose. In other words, it was moral, it was sort of cleansed of the immorality that is common in Greek and Latin authors. Milton didn't agree. Remember what he said about Areopagitica, about the need for the weeds in the midst of the wheat and so forth? He thought that you should not sanitize the texts. These are great authors. It's not garbage stuff that the students are reading. These are good authors that are teaching things that are plainly immoral. But he thinks that the students benefit from having the good in the midst of the evil because that's the way the world is. It actually helps them to discern it and to avoid it and to hate it, rather than cloistering them away and thinking that in a bubble and thinking that it's, you can keep them from such things. So why not present it as it was? So his successor, Alexander Gill, who was Milton's headmaster in 1620, agreed with Milton and would have given him the original texts that had not been purged of their worldliness. And he admired not only the original authors in Latin and Greek, but he also admired Edmund Spenser. And that's probably where Milton got his great love of Spenser, from Alexander Gill. But when he was writing, so here's the context, Milton's education was unusual. Grammar school education was largely Latin, more Latin, a little bit of Greek thrown in. So everyone's learning in Latin, speaking in Latin, writing in Latin. The whole Reformation takes place in Latin, by the way. Martin Luther writes his letters in Latin. And when you hear Luther standing up in public, "Here I stand, I can do no other," he says that probably in Latin, because he's speaking to a cardinal that's not from Germany. What do they converse in? Latin. It's the common tongue of everyone who's educated. They speak in Latin. It's just like in our day everyone speaks in English. It's just the common parlance of the church and of educated people. They write, converse in Latin. And that's even the Reformers. People think that Latin was the Catholic language and not other. But as I say, Wesley would have written himself in Latin. This is in the 18th century. Calvin would have done so. Luther would have done so. All of them would have. It would have been the case in America as well, and in Canada up until about 1945. Actually, until the 60s, everyone would have done Latin in school, which is interesting. The only thing that they would have learned in English would have been the 10 Commandments and the Articles of Faith. That's it. So that we make sure you got it all. You're not going to, even if you're not good in Latin, you've certainly understood that. You have to have memorized those, by the way. How many clergy can spit off the 10 Commandments? But you're to be able to write prose in the style of Cicero, write poetry in the style of Horace. That's the aim of education, is simply to write like those famous prose writers and poets, and the Latin ones at that, never mind the Greeks. That's the typical school education. School day goes from 8 in the morning till probably 5 o'clock at night. No summer break. No flexibility. And so kids hated school. Absolutely loathed it. Yes?
What the idea with summer break was so that kids could work the field? Like they could go help their parents work the farms and whatever.
In Milton's day, they didn't take a break. Remember, the kids that are taking an education not working the field because they don't work. These are the aristocrats. This is the elite. This is not your common people. These are not farm boys. Yeah, they don't get that. If they get an education, they get it at home. A private tutor. Milton had a private tutor. But people who have to till the fields are not ones getting this education at this stage. So the summer break in Canada, maybe that's the logic for it. Yeah, you got to be around for the harvest and so forth. That was the case when I was growing up. I remember kids in my school coming back a little late because they were harvesting tobacco. Back down in London, that was the crop down there. It's probably not now. It came with hands like leather because it really sharp cuts you and so forth. But no summer recess, and you have to learn to write Latin as if you were living in ancient Rome, basically. And that's it. That's the whole education. Shakespeare himself would have got this education, by the way. And they used a man by name of Lilly's Latin grammar. It was used from the 1540s all the way through the 18th century. One of the most hated books in all of academic history. And at the school that Milton went to, St. Paul's, the motto was either teach or learn or leave. Painted on the windows. Teach or learn or leave. He would have not only been forced to learn this, the whip would have been used, the cane, and used pretty liberally. Mr. Milton would doubtless have been flogged. As apt as he was, he himself would have probably been caned. But he didn't really need to do this because he was so adept at learning, so had a vocation to it, that he read, and this is in his Defensio Secunda, which we're not reading. He says this about his blindness. He said that from the age of 12, I rarely retired to bed from my studies before midnight, so by candlelight. This was the first thing that proved pernicious to my eyes, to the natural weakness of which were added frequent headaches. So he read by candlelight in the early morning and then all the way till after midnight. All his day was spent with reading. But note that he isn't prescribing this to everyone. He doesn't think it's useful, but it's useful for him. He just realizes that not everyone needs to be an academic like him. Not that he was an academic, but with that vocation to do what he felt called to do, which is to be a poet. So Gill, as much as Milton liked his education, and his education that expanded the curriculum beyond the Latin classics purified, Gill had a reputation for whipping the unprepared and birching them into their life. So if you didn't like it, you're going to get whipped into liking it. You will like it, or you're going to like it one way or the other. You're going to pretend you like it, and we'll use the whip. So Milton probably didn't do that. Probably didn't get whipped too much because he liked it, but certainly many of his classmates would have. Milton has that in mind when he's proposing this. Secondly, when he goes to Cambridge at 16, he's there along with all of the aristocrats of England, the gentry. He's in a dormitory which is nicknamed Rat's Hole. Sounds like it wasn't the most pleasant of places at Cambridge, by the way. They, as I said to you, I think earlier on in the class, he was nicknamed the Lady of Christ's, because he's at Christ College, but they call him the Lady. Milton explains it's because he had a slight build and fair complexion. He was a good-looking boy. But also he was devoted to a very strict chastity and self-respect at all times. So he's a very upstanding character, and he got mocked by the other boys. No girls there, by the way, at university. And he taught himself to write poetry and to be a true poem, his own words. So he meant to. We looked at his mask, which is a sort of a encomium to chastity. He sought to be what he presented in all of his thoughts, all of his words, all of his actions, etc. So Our Lady of Cambridge, or Our Lady of Christ's, rather. And he had a tutor. His tutor's name was Chapel. You'll find it interesting. In his second year, he gets expelled from Cambridge. They call it rusticated. That's the English phrase. Sent down. In Oxford and Cambridge, you're always going up. You go up to Cambridge, you go up to Oxford. You get sent down, he gets rusticated, he gets thrown out. Probably had been whipped by his tutor. Disagreed with his tutor on who knows what. We're not actually sure. But he was sent down for a whole semester. Let's say rusticated. He comes back to a different tutor and rather excels, and he makes up for the semester he lost and graduates at the same time as he would if he hadn't missed it. Okay, well, that's Milton, all right. But you can see he's chafing at the education he got. He did go to Cambridge. He did get a Master of Arts, which nobody gets a PhD in these days. He is a master of his subject. And yet he despises the education that he's learned, and he's determined not to force other people to receive the same that he had. And he particularly resented the professional monopoly of the clergy over education. It trains people to be clergymen. He didn't want to be a clergyman.